The disturbing truth about abandoned asylums. Abandoned places hold a unique kind of silence. But there is no silence more profound, more heavy, and more deeply unsettling than the silence of an abandoned asylum. These hulking, decaying structures that dot the landscapes of America, the UK, and beyond aren't just relics of a bygone architectural style. They are stone and mortar monuments to a terrifying chapter in human history. A chapter not of healing, but of hidden suffering. We explore these ruins today as dark tourism, drawn by a Gothic aesthetic and whispers of ghosts. But to truly walk those crumbling halls is to brush against a disturbing truth. These places are not haunted by the paranormal. They are haunted by the very real and often horrific legacy of what we once called medicine, what we once called mercy, and what we once did to society's most vulnerable. This is the disturbing truth about abandoned asylums. Our story begins not with malice, but with what was seen as profound enlightenment. In the mid-19th century, before the era of the massive state-run loony bin, there was a revolutionary idea. It was championed by American psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride. His Kirkbride Plan advocated for moral treatment. The belief was that beautiful, spacious, well-ventilated buildings set in serene countryside, away from the stresses of industrial cities, could cure mental illness through order, peace, and humane care. These asylums were designed to be self-sufficient sanctuaries with farms, kitchens, and workshops. They were palaces of hope. And this is the first disturbing layer: how a beautiful ideal became a blueprint for nightmare. The promise of moral treatment was swiftly crushed by a perfect storm of factors: immigration, urbanization, and a broadening, and often vague, definition of what constituted insanity led to catastrophic overcrowding. A building designed for 200 patients would soon house 2,000. The serene corridors became jammed. The individual care became impossible. The asylums transformed from therapeutic communities into massive, overcrowded warehouses for human beings society didn't know what to do with. They became dumping grounds not just for the mentally ill, but for the unwanted broadly. The epileptic, the developmentally disabled, the impoverished, the rebellious, unmarried pregnant women, and people who were simply eccentric. Once you were committed, the system was designed to keep you. You were institutionalized. The goal shifted from cure to containment. And within these sealed-off worlds, away from public scrutiny, the darkness took root. With overcrowding came underfunding and understaffing. The few doctors and nurses were often overwhelmed, leading to a reliance on untrained, sometimes cruel orderlies. To manage the sheer numbers, control became the prime objective. This gave rise to the era of brutal, experimental, and dehumanizing treatments that today form the core of the asylum's horror story. The restraints, the cold, wet sheets of the continuous bath, the spinning chairs, and then came the more invasive, irreversible procedures: malarial fever therapy, insulin shock therapy, metrazole shock therapy, which induced violent convulsions so severe patients would fracture their own spines, and the crown jewel of psychiatric horror, the transorbital, or ice pick, lobotomy. Pioneered by Walter Freeman, this crude, minutes-long procedure involved driving a leucotomy through the thin bone of the eye socket and severing the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. It was touted as a cure for everything from schizophrenia to depression to disobedient behavior in wives. The goal was not to heal, but to create a placid, docile, and manageable patient, an empty shell. Tens of thousands were performed, often without proper consent. This was industrialized psychiatry, treating the human mind as a faulty machine to be tinkered with, violently and without precision. But the horror wasn't confined to the operating theater. Daily life within the asylum walls was a study in deprivation and dehumanization. Patients were stripped of their identity, their clothes, their personal belongings. They were given numbers. They lived in barren, often freezing or sweltering wards. Boredom was a constant torture. There was little to no meaningful activity, therapy, or human connection. The sounds that filled these buildings were not the whispers of ghosts, but the real cries of people in distress, the clanging of locks, the screams from solitary confinement, quiet rooms. The smell was not just decay, but decades of concentrated human misery, antiseptic, and waste. This is the true haunting, the psychological residue of endless, hopeless days. So why are they abandoned? The deinstitutionalization movement of the mid-20th century, fueled by the advent of new psychiatric medications like Thorazine that promised a life outside the walls, and by exposes of the horrific conditions inside, led to a mass exodus. Asylums were slowly emptied, deemed inhumane and obsolete. They were left to rot. And this abandonment is the final, profound insult. These buildings, which witnessed unspeakable suffering, were not memorialized, not turned into museums of conscience. They were simply walked away from, left to decay like a shameful secret. This neglect allows us to forget the individuals who lived and died there. It allows the history to fade into spooky legend. But when we look at these ruins, we must see past the peeling paint and the vines breaking through the windows. We must see the systemic failure. The abandonment of the buildings mirrors the abandonment of the people inside them. It forces us to ask, have we truly progressed? Yes, the monstrous treatments are largely gone. The worst asylums are closed. But the crisis did not end with the closure of the doors. It was merely displaced. Today, the largest providers of mental health care in countries like the United States are not hospitals, but jails and prisons. Homelessness is rampant among the severely mentally ill. Community-based care is often underfunded, fragmented, and inaccessible. We have traded the asylum for the street, the prison cell, and the cycle of emergency room visits. The disturbing truth is that we never truly solved the problem. We just made it less visible, more diffuse, and in many ways, just as cruel. The abandoned asylum, therefore, stands as a stark warning. It is a monument to what happens when we treat human complexity as a problem to be locked away. When we prioritize society's comfort over the individual's humanity. When we allow out of sight, out of mind, to become a guiding principle for care. It warns us of the dangers of pseudoscience, of unchecked authority, and of our capacity for cruelty towards those we deem other. The ghosts we imagine in the shadows are a distraction. The real haunting is in the echoes of past failures that continue to resonate in our present-day systems. The next time you see a photograph of an abandoned asylum, with its grand, broken windows and foreboding atmosphere, don't just see a spooky relic. See a crime scene of a medical and ethical catastrophe. See a tomb for forgotten souls. And see a mirror asking us uncomfortable questions about how we treat the most vulnerable among us today. Because the most disturbing truth of all is that the asylum never really left us. It just changed its form. Because the most disturbing truth of all is that the asylum never really left us. It just changed its form. The final, perhaps most unsettling chapter in this story is the slow erasure of memory itself. As these buildings crumble, succumbing to demolition, vandalism, or redevelopment into luxury apartments. A bitter irony where spaces of profound suffering are sanitized into sought-after real estate. We lose physical evidence. We lose the power of place. The haunting becomes abstract, a story rather than a tangible, decaying reality you can stand in. This erasure allows us to distance ourselves. It lets us say, that was then a barbaric past. We are more enlightened now. But the architectural ghosts of the asylum are embedded in our modern systems. The long, echoing corridors find their parallel in the endless, Kafkaesque bureaucracy a struggling person must navigate to find help today. The institutional isolation is mirrored in the social isolation of the mentally ill person, in a society that still stigmatizes their condition. The failure of the massive, centralized asylum is repeated in the failure of massive, underfunded, and siloed social services. The cycle continues, just in a more decentralized and, therefore, less visibly shocking way. Furthermore, the asylum's legacy lives on in our language and our pop culture. We casually use terms like loony bin, nut house, or madhouse, stripping the historical reality of its gravity and turning human tragedy into a punchline. The horror movie trope of the sinister asylum, while effective for scares, often reduces a complex history of societal failure into a simple narrative of evil doctors and vengeful ghosts. This further obscures the truth, replacing historical reckoning with entertainment. It allows us to be thrill seekers instead of witnesses. So, what is the duty we have to these places and the memories they hold? While not every crumbling building can or should be preserved, their stories must be. The names of the patients, not just the infamous doctors, must be remembered. The accounts of survivors, the investigations by journalists, like Nellie Bly who went undercover, and the slow, hard-fought reforms must be studied. This isn't about macabre fascination. It's about ethical remembrance. It's about understanding that the line between care and cruelty, between sanctuary and prison, is frighteningly thin and requires constant vigilance to maintain. Visiting an abandoned asylum, whether in person or through photography, should not be a simple ghost hunt. It should be a somber pilgrimage, a confrontation with our collective shadow. When you feel that creepy atmosphere, that oppressive silence, learn to reinterpret it. It is not the presence of spirits. It is the absence of justice. It is the weight of forgotten pain. It is the echo of a system that treated human beings as objects to be managed. The disturbing truth about abandoned asylums is a multi-layered one. It is a story of good intentions, warped beyond recognition. It is a story of scientific arrogance and societal indifference. It is a story of how architecture can facilitate both hope and hell. And ultimately, it is a story about us, about our fear of the mind's fragility, our tendency to ostracize what we don't understand, and our tragic habit of repeating history in new, more insidious ways. The ruins stand as a warning. They whisper that the solutions we build can become the prisons we create. They urge us to look at our current systems of care, or lack thereof, and ask, are we building new asylums just with invisible walls? The answer to that question will determine whether we have truly learned from the disturbing, crumbling monuments we've left behind. The answer to that question will determine whether we have truly learned from the disturbing, crumbling monuments we've left behind. But to fully grasp the scale of this institutional failure, we must look beyond the grand architecture of Kirkbride buildings and examine the raw, bureaucratic machinery of confinement. Asylums, especially the later state hospitals, functioned as self-perpetuating economic ecosystems in often rural areas. They were major employers. Towns grew reliant on them. This created a perverse incentive to maintain high patient populations, not to cure them. A patient discharged was not just a success story. It was a loss of state funding and a potential job lost. This economic reality turned the noble ideal of a temporary sanctuary into a demand for permanent inmates. The commitment process itself was often shockingly simple, stripping individuals of their autonomy with terrifying ease. A husband could commit a difficult wife. Parents could commit a wayward child. A single doctor's signature, often based on vague criteria like melancholia, hysteria, or moral insanity, could consign a person to a life behind walls. Once inside, the label of lunatic became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Any protest, any anger at unjust confinement, was seen not as a rational response, but as further proof of insanity. The system was designed to validate itself, leaving no room for the patient's voice. This legal and social power dynamic is a core part of the disturbing truth. It reveals how easily society weaponized medicine to police nonconformity, especially among women and minorities. The experience within varied brutally along gender lines. Women were overwhelmingly vulnerable to commitment for conditions related to their reproductive health, postpartum depression, menopause, or simply for exhibiting traits deemed unfeminine, such as being overly sexual, intellectual, or refusing domestic duties. Treatments like forced hysterectomies or ovariectomies were performed under the guise of curing hysteria. For men, particularly from the working class, commitment could be punishment for vagrancy, alcoholism, or an inability to work. The asylum was a tool of social control, a threat that loomed over anyone who stepped too far outside rigid societal norms. The racial dimension adds another harrowing layer. In the United States, segregated asylums or wards provided even lower standards of care for Black patients, who were often diagnosed with more severe conditions based on racist pseudoscience. Their stories are doubly erased from the historical record. In other parts of the world, like the former British colonies, asylums were used as instruments of colonial control, pathologizing the resistance and cultural practices of indigenous populations. The disturbing truth is that the asylum was never a neutral medical space. It was a reflection and an enforcer of the prejudices, fears, and power structures of the society that built it. To walk through an abandoned asylum today is to walk through a fossilized hierarchy of suffering. The architecture itself tells this story. The grandiose administrative buildings with their fine woodwork faced the public. Behind them lay the wards, progressively more severe. The acute wards for new patients gave way to the chronic wards, which were little more than human warehouses. And finally, hidden in the back were the violent wards, the geriatric wards, and the infirmaries, the places where people were left to die. The decay we see now accelerates this narrative. The collapse starts in the patient wings. The roofs cave in there first. The paint peels fastest in the day rooms. Nature reclaims the patient courtyards, while the main gatehouse often remains eerily intact. The building's physical decay maps the hierarchy of care and neglect with cruel accuracy. This material erosion parallels the erosion of memory. As the plaster falls, revealing the lath underneath, so too do the individual stories disintegrate into anonymous statistics. Patient number 7,421, admitted 1932, died 1958, cause general paresis. Their hopes, their personalities, the sound of their voice, all gone, first by institutionalization, then by time. This is the ultimate victory of the asylum's legacy. Not just the destruction of minds, but the annihilation of identity from history. Our contemporary fascination with these places, often labeled urbex or urban exploration, exists in an ethical gray area. While explorers can document decay before it's gone and raise public awareness, the act can also veer into exploitation. Striking a dramatic pose in a restraint chair or treating a patient's graffiti as mere backdrop for a photo shoot risks reenacting the very dehumanization that made these places horrific. The challenge is to move beyond aestheticizing misery and towards bearing witness. Some organizations and historians are fighting this erasure, digitizing fragile patient records with ethical safeguards, recording oral histories from former staff, and advocating for thoughtful memorialization. The preserved ruins of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, or the museum at the Bedlam Asylum in London, serve as crucial, if controversial, sites of conscience. They force us to engage with the physical reality, not just the legend. The haunting question that lingers in the dust of these places is not, are ghosts real? But what does it mean to be sane in an insane world? Who gets to decide? The asylum era shows us the catastrophic consequences of allowing a small, often arrogant authority to answer that question for everyone else. It was a system that pathologized trauma, grief, poverty, and difference. In our modern era, we had traded one set of labels for another, and one set of chemical restraints for more sophisticated ones. The cycle of stigma persists, just in a new vocabulary. The abandoned asylum, therefore, is not an anomaly. It is a logical endpoint, a case study in what happens when we outsource our humanity to institutions. Its disturbing truth is a mirror, and the reflection it shows us is not of monsters but of ordinary people. Doctors, nurses, politicians, taxpayers, who, through a combination of good intentions, ignorance, indifference, and fear, built a machine of suffering and then walked away from it. The vines cracking the masonry are not just nature taking over. They are the questions we have left unanswered. Breaking back into our awareness, they ask us, who are we locking away today, literally or figuratively? What injustices are we building into our own systems that future generations will look back on with the same horror and disbelief? The silence of the abandoned asylum is not empty. It is loud with warning. It is the sound of a society failing its most vulnerable, and the echo is far from faded. To listen to that silence is the first step toward ensuring that this haunting legacy does not become our future.